Welcome, and thanks for coming out to hear the sights and sagas of New York City during American independence. Now, some people might be thinking to themselves, wait a minute, does this guy have the right city, New York? Because when people think about the American Revolution and American independence, they don't typically think about New York City as a historic site for this. Right? When people think about New York City, they think about skyscrapers and Times Square and hustle bustle and Broadway musicals and Wall Street. Right? But in fact, New York City has a rich and wonderful history with respect to the era of American independence. So New York City was involved in the American Revolutionary War right off the bat. Okay, so when the colonists declared independence in 1776, England immediately attacked America to put down this suppression. And where did England attack? None other than New York City. Okay, New York City. This was the first battle of the entire Revolutionary War. And this was no small affair either. No. This was enormous. This, in fact, was the largest battle of the entire Revolutionary War, right here in New York City. And it happened right away. So the colonists declared independence July 4th, 1776, and it was only a few weeks later that British ships, warships, came sailing in from the Atlantic Ocean into New York Harbor, into New York City. So there were accounts of people who lived in New York City at the time of looking out their window and seeing almost 500 British battleships in New York Harbor. Okay, this was a huge deployment. In fact, at the time, it was the largest expeditionary deployment in British history. Okay, so they were not kidding around here. So the ships docked in Staten Island. So the British used Staten Island as a staging ground. So they amassed their ships here and they amassed their troops on Staten Island. So George Washington, he was the newly appointed head of the new Continental Army. So he gets wind of this. And what does George Washington do? George Washington says, I need to go and defend New York City. So George Washington comes to New York City, and George Washington amasses his troops in New York City to prepare for this attack. Right? So this shows how significant New York City was to the nation, but also as a strategic military objective. So this sets up this amazing strategic chess match between the two senior generals. You've got George Washington as the head of the Continental Army for the entire American Army. And then you have his counterpart, which was a guy by the name of General William Howe. So this was the head of the entire British Army for the entire war. So they are both here in New York City squaring off against each other in this strategic chess match for the first battle of the Revolutionary War. So George Washington knows that General Howe is going to attack New York City, but he doesn't know where. Okay, there are two major possibilities. One possibility is that the British could invade Manhattan first, directly. But the other possibility was that the British might invade Brooklyn first. And the reason was because of the topography. So Brooklyn was located up on the heights. Okay, these big cliffs, right? So it's Brooklyn Heights. This is the neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights today, right on the East River. And this is an important strategic military location because you could position your cannons up on these heights, on this cliff, and then you could fire your cannons down into the New York Harbor. So this was an important location from a military perspective. So it doesn't take very long, and the British attack here. So Declaration of Independence was in July 1776, and General Howe begins his attack of New York City in August of 1776. So this is the very next month after the Declaration of Independence. They were not kidding around here. So where does General Howe attack? He attacks in Brooklyn. So this is the first battle of the Revolutionary War, kicks off the Revolutionary War, and it's an enormous battle. Tens of thousands of troops, the largest battle of the entire Revolutionary War. So this is why it becomes known as the Battle of Brooklyn. So let's take a look at the region here to get a sense of where this all went down in New York City. So this is a map of the New York City area, and today the New York City consists of 5 boroughs, or 5 localities. So here you have the borough of Manhattan, and above Manhattan to the north is the Bronx, which you can't see on this map, it's off the map. And over here you have the borough of Queens, the borough of Brooklyn, and the borough of Staten Island. So this battle took place in Brooklyn. So the Battle of Brooklyn. Now it also has a couple other names as well. It's also known as the Battle of Long Island. And the reason is because Brooklyn and Queens, they're on this landmass here, but this landmass is actually part of a longer island, Long Island, that goes off this map to the east for about 100 miles, this huge island. But not all of this is part of New York City. Only Brooklyn and Queens are part of New York City. But nonetheless, since Brooklyn is technically located on this landmass that is Long Island, it also becomes known as the Battle of Long Island. And it's also known as the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. And this is because there is a neighborhood, Brooklyn Heights, that had significant events occur there in the battle. So the battle has 3 names: the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Brooklyn, and the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. But don't be confused, because it all relates to the same battle, and it took place right here in Brooklyn. So let's take a closer look at the Brooklyn area here to get a sense of what happened in this battle. So this is Brooklyn. So this whole area is Brooklyn here. Just to orient yourself, up here is the southern tip of Manhattan peeking out, and down here is Staten Island. So as you can see, the battle took place right in the heart of Brooklyn. Now this is amazing to think about today, because Brooklyn is this densely populated city, right? This is part of the metropolis of New York City. This is where people live and work, and there's shops and theaters and businesses and all sorts of stuff right here in Brooklyn. So let's take a closer look of the contemporary map in Brooklyn to get a sense of these neighborhoods. So this is Brooklyn, and again, just to orient yourself, here is the southern tip of Manhattan, and here is Staten Island. So this is the whole neighborhood of Brooklyn. And one neighborhood here, these are widely known neighborhoods. So you've got Bay Ridge down here, Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and Sunset Park. And here are these 2 green patches in Brooklyn. So this green patch on the left is Greenwood Cemetery. The green patch on the right here is Prospect Park, the wonderful Prospect Park. Now it's amazing to think that Brooklynites today go out to Prospect Park on the weekend, relax in this wonderful park, and many of them have no idea that this was actually the site of a brutal battle during the American Revolutionary War. So right on Prospect Park, you have the neighborhood of Park Slope, and over here you have the neighborhood of Red Hook. And then just above Red Hook are a few other neighborhoods that are not on this map, but you have about right here, you have Carroll Gardens, you have Cobble Hill, and then you have Brooklyn Heights right here. Now this is the spectacular neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights. So this is a wonderful neighborhood today. So you can go there today and visit it. There is an outdoor esplanade at Brooklyn Heights, which is open to the public. It's right along the East River there, and it is spectacular because it's up on these heights, this cliff, and it overlooks the East River here. And East River is right here, and it overlooks New York Harbor, but it also overlooks the downtown area of Manhattan, which today consists of these huge skyscrapers of the financial district and Wall Street. So it is a spectacular place to visit just in and of itself, but it is also a wonderful historic site, because this is where the Battle of Brooklyn took place. And in fact, there is a plaque commemorating the Battle of Brooklyn today. And in fact, this is a wonderful example of a site right in New York City that relates to the founding of this nation. So let's go back to the map of the battle here to get a sense of where this battle took place and what happened in this Battle of Brooklyn here. So the blue color represents George Washington's troops for the American side, and the red color represents General Howe's troops for the British side. So only a few weeks after the Declaration of Independence, General Howe begins his attack. And where does he start? So he starts here in Staten Island because this is where he had been amassing his troops. And he takes his troops and shuffles them across this waterway, the Narrows, into Brooklyn. Now, incidentally, this location here is right where today is located the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. Now, of course, the bridge wasn't there then. There were no bridges built back then. But just to orient yourself as to contemporary times, this is where General Howe crossed his troops. So he ferries his troops across this Narrows into Brooklyn. Then he marches his troops northward to meet Washington's positions right here. And General Howe, the British troops, attack Washington right here in Brooklyn. And the Battle of Brooklyn and the Revolutionary War is underway. Now, General Howe then makes a strategic military maneuver. So what he does here is he takes a good portion of his troops, and instead of just attacking Washington's positions where Washington was waiting for him, General Howe takes a good portion of his troops and he marches them around this way, the back way. Okay, and what he's trying to do here is he's trying to flank Washington's troops. And flanking means you come around the end, you come around the flank. So you come around the side of Washington's troops. And if you are in battle and your troops are flanked, you are in big trouble. Because what happens is your enemy then sneaks up behind you and starts attacking you from behind. So now you're in trouble because not only are you fighting on the front where you intended, but now you have to take half of your troops, turn them around, and start fighting from behind because you're being attacked from behind. So your troops are now divided, you're being attacked on two fronts, and the likelihood is you are going to be wiped out. So some people say that this maneuver was a brilliant maneuver by General Howe for the British. But other people say, no. What this was a blunder by Washington, because Washington should have anticipated that his troops would be flanked, and Washington should have been prepared for it. But in fact, Washington was not prepared for this, and he ended up in this mess. His troops are flanked here. So right in the middle of this mess here, where Washington was flanked, there was located an old stone house. And this old stone house exists today. Now, this is not the original old stone house. That is no longer there. This is a reproduction, but nonetheless, it is wonderful. It is a wonderful place to visit, and it is a museum today. And it's right in the same location. So you can go to this site, you can go to this museum, and you can learn all about the Battle of Brooklyn and what happened, and they have these wonderful guided tours. You can even take tours of the actual battlefields, the battle sites in Brooklyn. It's a wonderful place. And it's another example of a fantastic site in New York City that relates to the founding of this nation. So back to Washington here. So Washington is in a jam because his troops have just been flanked. So if he doesn't do something, he is going to be wiped out. So Washington acts quickly here, and what he decides to do is take his troops that are here in the middle of this problem and withdraw them back. So retreat up to the safety of this area right up here, which is today Brooklyn Heights. Now, this makes a lot of sense. This was good for Washington because he got himself out of this jam. But this raises new problems, and that is when you are a military and you are retreating, you are very vulnerable because you're trying to do two things at the same time. You're trying to retreat, run away, but you're also trying to defend yourself because your enemy is pursuing you and attacking you. So as military history shows, many an army have been wiped out while they were retreating. So this is a military skill to try to conduct your retreat in a way that you're not wiped out. So what Washington did here was extraordinary, but it really shows the horrors of war. It just highlights the difficult situations that people are thrust into in war. It's horrible. So what Washington did in order to protect his retreating troops is he took a smaller unit of his troops, consisted of only about 400 men. And he had these 400 men charge the front line of the British. Okay, now, if you think about this mission, they really didn't stand much of a chance because this was only 400 American troops and there were thousands of British troops. Okay, so this was like a sacrifice, a sacrificial mission. You know, it's just horrible to think about. And you think about Washington, the difficult situation of Washington ordering this unit into what Washington knows will be their death. And worse, think about if you're in this unit. We were one of these 400 men. And these men were from Maryland, so they became known as the Maryland 400. And you know that you are being ordered here to your death, but nonetheless, these men did this, and they did this with honor and valor. They charged the English front lines. And this just shows how, brave and courageous they were, but also just the horrendous situations that people find themselves in war. So they charged the front line. Can I take questions at the end? Is that okay? Okay, thank you. So they charged the front lines, they charged the English front lines, and initially they were very successful. They pushed the English back, but then the English came with reinforcements, and what happened was, as we anticipated, and this smaller unit, the Maryland 400, were almost entirely wiped out. It was like 90% casualties. But their sacrifice was successful. So Washington was able to pull his troops back here out of this mess where he was flanked and consolidate his troops up here in the area of Brooklyn Heights. So their mission was successful here. So let's take a contemporary look at the map here to see where Washington was. So right here is the area of Brooklyn Heights where Washington had pulled back to. Now, if you look closely, you can see this yellow line here. Right here, this is the Brooklyn Bridge. Okay, now again, the Brooklyn Bridge was not there then because no bridges existed then, but just to orient yourself for today as to where this happened. So this is the Brooklyn Bridge here that connects Manhattan to Brooklyn, and right where the Brooklyn Bridge comes out on the Brooklyn side is this neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights. So this is where Washington was positioned now. Now, even though Washington escaped this mess of being flanked, Washington was in another jam here. And the problem that he had was he was now pinned down. And the reason he was pinned down is because his back was up against the water, up against the East River right here, and there was no escape by water. And the reason there was no escape is because the British fleet controlled this waterway. They controlled the New York harbor. So if Washington were to attempt to escape by water, the British fleet would have attacked him, and Washington would have been a sitting duck, and he would have been wiped out. There was also no escape by land, because what happened when Washington retreated here to Brooklyn Heights, General Howe for the British brought his troops up and surrounded Washington. So the British troops are now surrounding Washington here in a semicircle, and Washington is pinned down right here in Brooklyn Heights. Now, what happened next is extraordinary. So General Howe orders his troops to stop the attack. Okay, stop the attack. Okay, this was extraordinary. Okay, so General Howe's officers came to him and said, General Howe, dude, what are you doing? Okay, we have Washington right where we want him. We've got him pinned down. What we need to do now is attack Washington. Okay, we can wipe him out right here, right now. But General Howe overrides his officers and says, no, stop the attack. Why? Why does General Howe not attack? And the likely explanation for this is because General Howe was in a very similar situation only a year earlier. And this was up in Boston. So this was the Battle of Bunker Hill. And what happened there was a little skirmish that broke out. The American colonists took the top of Bunker Hill, and the British said, you know what, we want to charge up the top of Bunker Hill, knock the colonists off, and take the top of Bunker Hill for ourselves. And this is what they did. And General Howe was there then for the British. So the British rush up the Bunker Hill, knock the colonists off, and take the position. And they won the day. But it came at a huge cost because many British soldiers were wiped out as they rushed up this hill. So after this, General Howe remarked, it was not worth it. Taking this position was not worth it, okay, because they lost too many soldiers, including a lot of officers. So skip ahead to today, or a year later, here they are in the Battle of Brooklyn, and General Howe finds himself in basically the same situation. Right, here they are, Washington's on top of Brooklyn Heights, and General Howe could have charged Washington and wiped him out, but he knows there's going to be a cost. So General Howe says to himself, I'm not making the same mistake twice. And also General Howe thinks to himself, you know what? There is a better solution here. That what we'll do is we'll just surround Washington and we will conduct a siege, a blockade. Washington's trapped. He's got no escape. He's going to run out of supplies very quickly, and he will realize that he has no option but to surrender. So this is a much better outcome because Washington will surrender completely. We will achieve this complete surrender of our enemy, and we will not lose any of our own lives of our own British troops. So this actually makes a lot of sense. It was actually a rational decision. So this is the likely explanation as to why General Howe did not attack Washington. And in fact, this is the explanation that General Howe gave subsequently. So Washington, even though at least he's not being attacked anymore because the General Howe ordered a stop to the attack, but nonetheless, Washington is in a jam because he's trapped. And General Howe's right. If Washington doesn't do something here, he's going to have to surrender. So what does Washington do? Well, Washington decides to attempt a daring escape. He tries to escape out of this mess. And his escape plan is that he is going to wait for darkness to fall, and then under the cover of night, he is going to try to whisk his troops out of Brooklyn Heights, across the East River, and into the safety of Manhattan. So let's take another look at that contemporary map. So Washington was pinned down here in Brooklyn Heights, which is right here. And what he decides to do for his escape is he decides to wait for the cover of night, and he orders all these people, to anybody who has a boat along this waterway, have to bring their boat down to this location. It doesn't matter if it's a small boat, canoes, anything. And then he will take his troops here from Brooklyn Heights and ferry them across the East River to the safety of Manhattan here in the middle of the night. Okay, so this is his daring escape plan. So the day passes, and pretty soon night falls, and Washington gets his escape operation underway. He begins to ferry his troops across the East River. And he also engages in a little deception here. So what he does is when he evacuates a unit of troops, he leaves a few men behind and he orders them to stoke the bonfires. So keep the bonfires burning brightly and make some noise and ruckus. So when the British look out during the night, they see that all these bonfires are continuing to burn all across, and they think that Washington's troops are still in their camps, when in fact, Washington's troops are escaping. So the operation gets underway, but pretty soon things start to go wrong. And Washington, there's these miscommunications, and troops aren't sure when they're supposed to evacuate, and things get bungled. And Washington realizes that he's not going to make it. He is not going to be able to evacuate his troops across the river before daybreak. And when daybreak comes, the sun rises, light is everywhere. The British will be able to see that Washington is escaping. They will attack Washington and wipe him out. So Washington is encouraging his troops, come on, hurry up, get across the river. But pretty soon it becomes clear he is not going to make it, and he doesn't make it. So pretty soon, day breaks, the sun rises. However, due to a freak of nature, a thick fog had descended upon the area that morning. And this was a super thick fog. It was thick like pea soup. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. And this enables Washington to continue his evacuation through the day. Even though the sun had risen, he continued to escape. And the British could not see this because they could not see through the fog to see that Washington was escaping. So as a result of this, Washington's plan worked. Washington escaped. Okay, now this was extraordinary. It was a miraculous escape against all odds. If you think about it, it was really only by chance that Washington escaped, right? It was really two things. It was really, number one, the fact that General Howe did not attack. Washington had no control over that. That was number one. And number two, it was the weather. All right, it was that the fog came in, and that enabled Washington to finish his escape. So it was by pure chance that Washington accomplished this miraculous escape. Now, this was extraordinary. It was extraordinary not only for the Battle of Brooklyn, but for the entire Revolutionary War, and indeed for history. Because you think about, if Washington had not escaped, which was the overwhelming likelihood, Washington likely would have been wiped out there, and that almost certainly would have ended the entire Revolutionary War right there, right then, in the first battle. Now, if you think about the implications of that, that means that the United States may never have existed. And in fact, we all might still be under the British crown. So Washington's escape was extraordinary. Extraordinary for this nation and extraordinary for history. It's amazing. So, even though Washington escaped, this was nonetheless a huge defeat for Washington and a huge victory for the English, right? Because this was the first time these two armies had met on the battlefield in this war. And what happened? The British creamed the Americans, right? The British flanked Washington's troops and then basically just creamed them. So the British were thrilled with this, and news of this battle went back to England and back up to the King of England, and everybody was thrilled, and General Howe becomes this huge hero in England. And in fact, as a result of this battle, General Howe was knighted. Okay, that's how much of a hero he was in England. Now, it's funny how the tables turned, because only a few years later, when the tide of the battle turned, he became a scoundrel in England, and everybody blamed General Howe for losing the entire war because he didn't attack Washington when he had the chance. It's amazing how history works out, and even though it's sort of unfair, because Howe actually made a rational decision not to attack, but nonetheless, he ended up being blamed for losing the entire war. So, what happened in the Battle of Brooklyn? Well, the English take over Brooklyn, certainly, but they did not stop there. So the British troops then went into Manhattan, invaded Manhattan, and pushed up in Manhattan. So as the British troops pushed up in Manhattan, they pushed Washington back. So the British troops would advance, Washington would retreat. The British advance, Washington retreat. And this went on for months. So the British pushed Washington out of Manhattan up into Westchester. Washington then was pushed across the Hudson River into New Jersey, and then Washington was pushed down and across through New Jersey, all the way across the Delaware River and into Pennsylvania. So this was a huge defeat for Washington. And as a result of this, the British military took over New York City, and the British military occupied New York City for the entire rest of the Revolutionary War. Now, it's amazing to think about today, but this is what happened in New York City. So, as we know today, it was tremendously significant that Washington escaped, this miraculous escape, because he lived to fight another day. So Washington was able to stretch the war out for another 5 years or so, and ultimately Washington came roaring back and defeated the British, and the Americans won the American Revolutionary War and kicked out England. So after England was kicked out of America, what did the colonists do? Well, they looked at each other and they said, what do we do now? How do we govern ourselves? Right? Because they didn't have a government. The government all came from the British Crown for some 170 years. Right? So when they kicked out the British, there was no government. So this is when the colonists said, look, we've got to put something together here. They convened the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787, and they created the government that we have to this day. They wrote the Constitution, they created the 3 branches of government. And there was one central question that arose when our founding fathers created this nation, and that question was, where should we locate the first capital? Okay, which city in the United States should be the capital of this new nation? Okay, now, if you ask people today, what was the first capital city of the United States, many people will say Washington, D.C. And that's because, Washington is the capital today. And, the Washington Monument seems like it's been around forever. But in fact, Washington, D.C. was not the first capital city of the United States. Other people would say Philadelphia. And this is a good guess because Philadelphia had a lot to do with the founding of this nation. But Philadelphia also was not the first capital. The first capital of the United States was New York City. Okay, so this is surprising to a lot of people because they think of New York City as skyscrapers and, oh my gosh, where in New York City did this happen? And is there a site that you can visit today? Well, let's take a look at New York City. So this is a wonderful aerial view of New York City. So this is the island of Manhattan here. On the left, you have the Hudson River, and then New Jersey over to the west. Above Manhattan, you have the borough of the Bronx. Here you have the borough of Queens peeking out here along the East River. And down here, you have Brooklyn Heights. In fact, this is Brooklyn. This is Brooklyn Heights. This is the location where Washington was trapped, right here. And here's the Brooklyn Bridge. So this is the Brooklyn Bridge right here that crosses the East River. And this is the site of Washington's daring escape here. So next time you visit the Brooklyn Bridge, think about what happened right here. It was this daring escape from Brooklyn to Manhattan that gave rise to the creation of this nation right here, right in New York City. So you look at the island of Manhattan, this giant rectangle is Central Park, which is a wonderful public space. Then you have this strip of large skyscraper buildings, which is Midtown Manhattan. Then if you come down to the southern tip of Manhattan, you have another grouping of large skyscrapers. And this is the financial district in the Wall Street area. And this is divided by Broadway. So Broadway is a main thoroughfare that runs north and south through New York City. Now, many people think of Broadway as the theater district. And this is true. Broadway runs through the theater district, which is about right here, right in near Midtown. But Broadway runs more than just through the theater district. It runs the length of New York City. In fact, it sort of curves around in New York City and cuts across the city grid, which has earned it the name of the crooked spine of Manhattan. So the Broadway runs down through the financial district as well, and then off of Broadway running to the east is Wall Street. So Wall Street runs all the way down to the East River. So let's take a closer look at that intersection. So here is Broadway that runs north and south. And then off of Broadway, you have Wall Street that runs east here. And if you were to continue Wall Street off the map here to the east, it would go all the way to the East River. So here is the intersection of Broadway and Wall Street. And right at the head of Wall Street is the magnificent Trinity Church. So this is a spectacular church. And this photo is wonderful also because it shows the juxtaposition between the old and the new. You have the old of Trinity Church, and Trinity Church was there at the founding of this nation. It was there then. And then you have the skyscrapers on the side of Wall Street. So this photo is looking straight up Wall Street. Trinity Church is at the head of Wall Street, and these skyscrapers are on the side of Wall Street. And inside, they're conducting the business of the global financial trade. So if you just take a few steps and walk down Wall Street from Broadway, walk down Wall Street a few steps, and you come right to the New York Stock Exchange. So this is the New York Stock Exchange. So this is where all the global center of trading of securities is going on. And here is a look of the iconic building of the New York Stock Exchange. And inside the stock exchange, you have all the traders and specialists and the trading pits and the screens, and they're trading fast and furiously back and forth of all their securities. And this is what people think of when they think of the Wall Street area. They think of global finance. But as it turns out, just steps from the New York Stock Exchange is Federal Hall. And Federal Hall was the location of the first capital of the United States, right in New York City, right on Wall Street. So here's a look of it today. So this is Federal Hall. Now, this is not the exact same building that existed at the time of our founding fathers. That building is no longer there. It was replaced by this building, and it was replaced for government offices, although today it is run by the National Park Service. So you can go and visit it today, and you can go inside and take tours of it. And again, it is another wonderful site right in the heart of New York City that relates to the founding of this nation. So this was the site of the first Capitol building. So just like there's the Capitol building in New York, in Washington, D.C. today that houses Congress, this was the first Capitol building of the nation. This is where the first Congress met. This is where they enacted the first laws of the nation. The Bill of Rights was drafted in part here and negotiated in part here. The Supreme Court met here, the first Supreme Court. And of course, the president was here. So this statue out in front of Federal Hall is a statue of George Washington. And the reason this statue is here is because this was the site where George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States. Okay, right here, right in New York City, right on Wall Street. Now, if you'll notice, the statue itself is elevated above ground. So you can see the people along here, and you can see the statue is considerably up above the heads of the people. And there is a reason for the location of this statue. And the reason is that they were trying to replicate the precise spot where George Washington was standing while he took the oath of office. Now, to understand this, you need to understand the first original building that was there at the site. So let's take a look at that. So here is the original Federal Hall. And if you look closely, you can see that there is an outdoor balcony on the second floor. And this is where the inauguration took place. So here's a look of it. So here you can see a bunch of dignitaries who are here attending the inauguration. And right here is George Washington. So you can see that George Washington's right arm is extended out and his right hand is resting on the Bible. His left hand is over his heart, and he is being sworn in as he takes the oath of office right here on the outdoor balcony on the second floor of Federal Hall. Now, if you look in the background, you can see the magnificent Trinity Church. So this is Trinity Church at the head of Wall Street. So this is right on Wall Street. Wall Street is running right here. So here's another look of it. This is from the perspective is as if you attended the inauguration, if you were a citizen. So you'd be in the street, you'd look up at Federal Hall, and you'd see the second floor here. And on the second floor, this is where George Washington was being sworn in. So now you can appreciate the location of this statue and what's going on here. So this is the approximate location. So if you're here today, standing in the street, this is what you would have seen. You look up, there is George Washington on the second floor of the balcony being sworn in. And that is what is depicted by this statue. You can see George Washington's right arm is extended out. His hand is open as if it is resting on the Bible, as right when he is being administered the oath of office and becoming the first president of the United States. So here's a perspective of it from what George Washington would have seen right when he's being sworn in from the second floor. So he'd be looking out here into the streets. Now, of course, these skyscrapers weren't there back then. Although it's interesting, you can see here that how close the New York Stock Exchange is. So this is the New York Stock Exchange, and you can see it is just steps from Federal Hall, just steps from where George Washington was sworn in. But George Washington would have seen thousands of people thronging the streets to come to this inauguration. And right after George Washington took the oath, the dignitary who administered the oath turned to the crowd and proclaimed, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States." And the crowd breaks out in a huge cheer, and people are firing their guns in celebration, and they're hanging out windows and off tops of buildings and everything, and it's a great celebration. And it all happened right here. This was the first president and the birth of our nation. And it's amazing to think that this happened right in New York City, right on Wall Street. Now, so New York City was the first capital of this nation. And this leads many people to wonder, well, wait a minute, how did the capital then get relocated out of New York City and to Washington, D.C.? And this is a fascinating question. So what happened was this became a huge issue with the Founding Fathers. So when the Founding Fathers were trying to set up this nation, the location of the capital became this enormous problem. They couldn't agree on where to locate the capital. And the reason they couldn't agree is because it got caught up in a much larger question about the government as a whole. And this is a central question that existed back then at the founding of our fathers, and it exists to this day. And that question is whether we should have a centralized federal government or whether power should be distributed out to the states, and the states should be able to do whatever they want in their own states. So this is the states' rights argument. This was a huge question at the time among our founding fathers, and it remains a huge question in our society today. In fact, you see it in every single election today, contemporary times, right? Whenever you hear a politician say, I don't want some bureaucrat in Washington telling me how to run my state, right? This goes back to the same question of whether we should have strong central federal government or whether power should be sent to the states. This was a raging question back then with our founding fathers, and it divided our founding fathers into two camps. And the two camps were led by two of our most famous and our towering founding fathers. So the leader of one camp was Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton wanted a strong central federal government. Opposing Hamilton was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was terrified of a central government. Thomas Jefferson wanted states' rights. And along with Thomas Jefferson was his buddy, James Madison. But the two central founding fathers that embodied these two positions were Hamilton and Jefferson, and they were opposed to each other. And this was a huge conflict among our two founding fathers here. So what was this all about? So what was Hamilton's vision? Well, Hamilton had this grand vision. It's amazing that he saw this back in the 1700s. His vision was that you needed a strong central federal government in order to bring all these 13 individual states together to create one unified central government. And that unified central government could then rise as a world power. But you needed the strong central government. You couldn't just leave it up to the states. Because if you left it up to the states, you gave power to just the states would run in their own directions, they'd be all conflicted with each other, they wouldn't be able to get along, and you would not have a centralized government or country. And the reason he felt this, one of the reasons that he had this position, was because of Hamilton's experience in the Revolutionary War just a few years earlier. So what happened there was George Washington and Alexander Hamilton were administering this war. Hamilton was a senior aide to George Washington. So they were trying to administer this war, run this war. And they said, okay, states, you want us to run this war? They said, okay, of course, we need a bunch of stuff to run this war. So they went out to the states and they made a request. They said, we need men for an army. So states, you have to contribute men. We need supplies. We need artillery. We need ammunition, gunpowder, uniforms, food, boots, right? So they put together a list and they made the request to all the 13 states. And what did the 13 states do? They said, nah, you don't need all that. You don't need all those men. We'll give you some men, but we're not going to give you all that. And you don't need all that supplies and all that money. We'll give you some, but we're not going to give you all that you asked for. Washington and Hamilton couldn't believe this. Okay, they felt like, look, you've got us fighting this war, and we're fighting the war for you, okay, but you're not giving us what we need to fight the war. And nonetheless, we are fighting, the British Empire, arguably the largest empire and the most powerful empire in the world, and you're not even giving us what we need to fight this war. They felt like they were having to fight this war with one arm tied behind their back. They couldn't believe this was happening. This was what Hamilton realized. This is why you need a strong federal government. You need a federal government that has power over the states to make the states do things for the benefit of the whole. Because if you don't have a federal government, the states will not act for the benefit of the whole. They'll act in their own self-interest, and this is a nightmare. So this is why when Hamilton then became a founding father and started creating the government, this is why Hamilton said, we need a strong central government. Now, part of Hamilton's vision was also to create a federal economic system. Okay, so he said, look, we need, for the government to exist, to have this unified federal government, we need a centralized economic system. And key to Hamilton's vision was the federal government assuming the war debts of the states. So what happened was when the Revolutionary War started, the states took on debts in order to pay for the war. So after the war was over, the states were burdened by these debts. So what Hamilton said is he had this vision that said, wait a minute, if we have the federal government take over these debts, the states will be free, they'll get out from under these debts, the federal government can then pay off the debts. This is how to bring the country together. And this was key to it all, because if the federal government assumed debts, well, now you need a federal economic system. The federal government needs to be able to issue debt and issue bonds, and then you need a national bank, and then you need a central currency. You need this unlocks Hamilton's grand vision. So the first step and key to it all was to have the federal government assume the war debts of the states. So Hamilton's vision was by creating this federal economic system and this strong central government, the federal government could act for the benefit of all the states. So it could collect this money, and then it could distribute the money around to all the 13 states and do things like build roads and bridges, create the infrastructure, subsidize industries to help create businesses. And now private people in all 13 states can create their own businesses. This will unify the country, the businesses will rise, and this nation will rise to a world power. Hamilton had this grand vision back in the 1700s. And in fact, this is the vision that we now have in today's United States. It is amazing. Okay, so this was Hamilton's grand vision. Jefferson, on the other hand, was terrified at this vision. He did not want the central government to be created and to have power. And the reason was because you think about Jefferson and Madison and his party, they were from the South, okay? And they had a lot of power in their individual states. They had these huge plantations, they were extremely wealthy, and they controlled their own states. So they wanted to be left alone. They wanted to do run their own states the way they wanted to run their states. They didn't want a central federal government threatening their own rule in their own states. And they sort of viewed this as, wait a minute, this is just like being under the King of England, having a central power telling us what to do. We don't want that. We want to be able to do whatever we want to do in our own states. So this is what set up the conflict between Hamilton and Jefferson. So the location of the capital got caught up in this huge central issue. And the reason was because it had to do with power between the North and the South. So what Hamilton wanted is he wanted the capital to remain in New York City, because Hamilton had this vision for creating the financial sector, which had started in New York City. And then if you locate the capital in New York City as well, now you have these two centers of power, the financial industry as well as the government, and they will grow together in the same location and build out together and create this wonderful federal government. This terrified Jefferson and Madison, right? Because they said, wait a minute, if you locate the capital in the North is going to have all this power, and the North will have more power than the South. And this is a problem for the Southerners, because the North could then enact laws, and when they enact laws, it wouldn't be just for the North, but it would be for the entire country, including the South, which means the North could impose laws upon the South. So Jefferson and the Southerners did not like this idea of the capital being located up north. And if you think about it, an underlying issue in this power struggle was the issue of slavery. And the reason was because there was the possibility that the North could impose laws on the South, and they might even ban slavery, not just in the North, but in the entire country, including in the South. And this was a big problem for the Southerners, right? Because the Southerners had these big plantations. Their entire economy was built up around slavery, the institution of slavery. But in the North, they didn't have slavery. They didn't have these huge plantations. Their economy wasn't dependent upon slavery. They were dependent upon banking and manufacturing and industries and these sorts of things. So it was easy for the Northerners to ban slavery. Boy, slavery is a bad thing. Let's ban it. But the fear was, hey, let's ban it in the South too. Well, if they banned slavery in the South, the Southerners feared this would destroy their economy. All these rich and powerful men would now be wiped out. So slavery was sort of an underlying issue here about where to locate the capital, North and South. So they could not agree on this. Congress was divided. They could not agree. It was a logjam. It was gridlock. So finally, they broke through the gridlock and solved this problem as to where to locate the capital. And how did this happen? Well, it all happened in New York City. So it happened at the New York City residence of Thomas Jefferson. Now, this is another thing, actually, that people don't often think about, and that is that all these founding fathers lived in New York City at the time. Okay, they were in New York City. They were running around downtown Manhattan. Okay, now, people don't typically think of this, but New York City was the first capital. The Congress was located there, right? So all these people lived there. Now, of course, they maintained their plantations and their homes in other states, but they were living in New York City because this is where the government was. So Thomas Jefferson had his place on Maiden Lane, which is a street downtown. George Washington was on Cherry Street. Alexander Hamilton, he lived right on Wall Street for a time. He lived in a couple other places as well. So Thomas Jefferson hosts a dinner at his New York City residence, and who does he have over? Jefferson has over his buddy, James Madison, and they invite their nemesis, Alexander Hamilton. So over at Jefferson's place, you've got Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. And the idea was they were going to try to resolve this issue of where to locate the capital of the nation. So they're at dinner here, and they're going back and forth and debating these issues, and North and South, and the power struggle, and all that. And finally, they reach a compromise. And the compromise was this. Jefferson and Madison agreed that Hamilton could have his way of the federal government assuming the war debts of the states. Now remember, this was huge because this was the key that unlocked Hamilton's entire vision of creating this economic system, this federal economic system. So this was huge, a huge win for Hamilton, and it was a huge concession for Jefferson and Madison. But in exchange, Hamilton agreed that the capital could be relocated out of New York City and someplace down south. That was the grand compromise. So Hamilton gets the federal government to assume the war debts, but in exchange, the capital of the nation must be located down south. So this happened in the summer of 1790, so it is known as the Compromise of 1790, and it all happened right in New York City. Now, they did not select the specific location of the capital at this dinner. They just agreed that it would be located down south. So to select a specific location, they decided, you know what, let's give it to George Washington. So George Washington was the president now, the first president of the United States. He's this extremely respected guy. Let's let George Washington decide. So George Washington decides where to have the capital of the United States. And where does he have the capital? He puts the capital just right up the way from his own plantation. So you can see on the map here, this is George Washington's own personal plantation here, Mount Vernon, and it is right on the Potomac here. So George Washington says, well, let's create the capital of the nation right up the way from me, right here in Washington, D.C. So this is the location that would become Washington, D.C., right up from George. Nice and convenient there. So at the time, there was no city there at Washington, D.C. It was basically this big swamp area. So they had to bring in all this landfill and build up the city from scratch. So George Washington is put at the head of a committee designed to create this new city. So basically, George Washington oversaw the design and creation of Washington, D.C. from scratch. So they created the city out of nothing. They laid out the city grid, they laid out the public spaces, they decided where the buildings were going to be, where the Capitol building would be, where the White House would be. They created the city from scratch. So the plan for the Capitol was that the first Capitol is located in New York City, and it would be in New York City for 2 years. So from 1788 to 1790 in New York City. Then they would move it to Philadelphia, where it would remain for 10 years. And during this 10-year period, Washington, D.C. would be built. And then after the 10 years, in 1800, the capital would shift to Washington, D.C., where it remains to this day. So that is the story of the capital of this nation, and it all took place in New York City. Now, we certainly cannot talk about New York City during the age of American independence without talking about one person in particular. And that person is none other than Alexander Hamilton. And the reason to talk about Hamilton is not just because he has a hit musical on Broadway, although that's pretty cool, but Hamilton was a New Yorker. He was a New Yorker through and through. Now, people don't typically think of the founding fathers as being from New York City, but Hamilton was. He was from New York City. Now, Hamilton was not born in New York City. In fact, he was not even born in America at all. He was born in the Caribbean. So Hamilton was born on the island of Nevis, which is just south of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and it was a British colony. And the circumstances of Hamilton's birth, in fact, the circumstances of Hamilton's life are extraordinary. So Hamilton was born out of wedlock. Okay? His parents were not married when he was born. So he was an illegitimate child. Okay, now this was not good back then. Okay, so Hamilton, then only a few years after his birth, his father abandoned the family. And a few years later, when Hamilton was only about 13 years old, his mother died. So Hamilton now is an illegitimate child, and now he has no parents, so he is now an orphan. Okay, so this was an extremely difficult life here for Hamilton. But he was this brilliant kid, and everybody recognized it. It was astonishing. In fact, this is a characteristic of Hamilton's life. It happens over and over again. People recognize his extraordinary ability, and they take him under their wing. And this is one of the reasons for Hamilton's extraordinary rise. So this happens right from the beginning, right when he was a kid. So the people, the adults in his village recognize, wow, this kid is so extraordinary. We've got to do something for him. He needs a formal education. We can't let him waste away his life here on this island. So they take up a collection for him because Hamilton had no money. So they take up a collection for this young boy, Hamilton, and they send him to America to have a formal education. So Hamilton ends up in New York City. Now, this is extraordinary. You think about it. He was only around 17 years old at the time. He comes to this new nation. He is an illegitimate child, an orphan, and now he is an immigrant to a new country, and in New York City, no less. He doesn't know anybody. He's by himself. He has no family. And what happens to him? He ends up being one of the founding fathers of this nation and one of the central figures in all of history. It is an extraordinary life. It's amazing. So Hamilton arrives in New York City, and he enrolls in King's College. This is for his formal education. This is the whole purpose of sending him to America. So he enrolls in King's College. Now, King's College today is Columbia University. So Hamilton went to Columbia. Now, people who know Columbia know that it's on the Upper West Side of Manhattan today, but back then it was located downtown in the financial district area. In fact, everything was located downtown. The entire city was downtown. Anything north of the downtown area was basically farmland, undeveloped land. So Hamilton's in King's College here, enrolls in King's College, and he becomes swept up in this movement for the revolution, for independence. And you can sort of imagine why, right? Because when Hamilton was born under the British system in the Caribbean, he was an illegitimate child, and he was discriminated against. Right? He couldn't get into the schools that he wanted. And, he suffered this discrimination, and he must have been thinking, this is so unfair, because Hamilton, he had nothing to do with his birthright, his birth circumstance. He had nothing to do with his parents being married or not married. Yet, nonetheless, his future is being defined by that. It must have been so frustrating for him. So now when he comes to America, this possibility of creating this new nation where you are not limited by your circumstances of your birth, but instead you can achieve whatever success is you can go as far as your ability will take you. This must have been enormously compelling for Hamilton. So he gets swept up in this movement towards the revolution, and he begins writing pamphlets, and he does this without signing them, so anonymously, which was common back then. But his pamphlets are published, and they're popular. People are reading them because he was such an eloquent writer. And people thought, wow, this is powerful writing. This must have been written by some dignitary, right? Some nobleman. When in fact, it was this teenage kid, right, this illegitimate child, immigrant and orphan, who was writing these pamphlets. This is how extraordinary Hamilton was. So he begins giving speeches back then as well. But Hamilton viewed his future as being in the army and being on the battlefield, fighting. He wanted to fight. Okay, so he saw his future, his success in fighting on the battlefield, glory on the battlefield. So he was trying to get himself in the army. And in the meantime, he formed this little voluntary militia. And it was basically a bunch of his buddies from King's College. So he recruited his buddies, hey, let's form this militia. So they start drilling. They take it seriously. So they start drilling and practicing in downtown Manhattan. In fact, right at Trinity Church. So they were drilling in the churchyard, Trinity Church and St. Paul's Church, a nearby church. So they're practicing, they're drilling, firing their muskets and this sort of thing. But then opportunity comes along. And there was an opportunity for Hamilton's little voluntary militia unit to join a real operation of the regular army. And the mission was to go down to the southern tip of Manhattan, to the Battery. And there was a fort there that had been occupied by the British. And the idea was to do this in the middle of the night and conduct a raid on this fort and steal a bunch of British supplies. So Hamilton and his buddies do this. So here is a look of the fort today. So this is the fort down at the Battery. Now, this is not the exact same fort that existed at the time that Hamilton was on his little midnight raid here, because this fort was actually rebuilt for the War of 1812, in anticipation of the War of 1812. So this fort was rebuilt a few decades later. But nonetheless, it gives you a sense of what it was like down there, and it was the same site. And this site is a magnificent site. So this is the southern tip of Manhattan, right on the water, the very southern tip. And the circular part that you see is the fort itself. And you can see that this is just a spectacular site because it's surrounded by this magnificent park. And then it's ringed by these skyscrapers in the financial district on Wall Street. So it is a wonderful site to visit just in and of itself. But also, it is a historic site. So it is yet another site right in the heart of New York City that relates to the founding of this nation. So it is a wonderful site to visit. And in fact, the fort itself is now run by the National Park Service. So you can go into the fort and take tours, and it's spectacular. And when you go and visit the site, particularly as you're walking up the promenade there and approaching the fort, you cannot help but transport yourself back in time and envision Hamilton and his buddies, sneaking up on this fort in the middle of the night, ready to conduct their raid of the fort. So it's really a great place. So this raid is successful, actually. So Hamilton and his buddies do a raid on this fort, and they run away with 21 cannons, 21 British cannons out of the 24 that were there. So this is a successful raid, and this gets Hamilton noticed. And ultimately, Hamilton actually gets a position in the real military. They make him captain of an artillery unit. So this is a unit that has cannons. So their role in the military is to position their cannons and fire their cannons in battle. So Hamilton is the captain of this, commanding this unit. But he's running all around New York. So this was, he's a young man here. He is sort of becoming a man. New York is his stomping grounds, the Manhattan, downtown Manhattan. So after the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, they sent a copy of the Declaration of Independence to New York City. And they read the Declaration of Independence aloud in public. And this occurred right in the park in front of City Hall. And Hamilton was there for that. He was there for the reading of the Declaration of Independence. So this turns into a protest, and the crowd gets a little raucous, and they end up rumbling down Broadway to Bowling Green. So Bowling Green is another open sort of public place like a park, and there's another crowd there, and they're getting rowdy, and they end up tearing down the statue of the King of England, of King George III, right on Bowling Green. And Hamilton was there for this. He was part of this ruckus here. So Hamilton's unit also set up a military camp for themselves in today what is the location, the intersection of Canal Street and Mulberry Street. So that is right in the heart of Little Italy and Chinatown, where those two intersect. Hamilton's unit also built a fortification on 23rd Street in Manhattan. So this is on the west side of 23rd Street. They built this fortification for their cannons, and in fact, George Washington inspected it. He inspected what they built, their work, and he was impressed. He complimented Hamilton. Great job at this. There's actually a little bit of a funny story in that at one point, these two British ships are sailing down the Hudson River, and Hamilton's in this fortification on 23rd Street. And he sees this, and he orders his cannons to fire at these British ships in the Hudson River. And the British ships actually returned fire. So this is brief because it only occurred as the British ships were passing, but nonetheless, it's just extraordinary to think of Hamilton firing cannons from 23rd Street in Manhattan at these British ships that were passing in the Hudson River. But this is what happened. So Hamilton is actually part of the military here. He is part of the war. Now, as we know, the war kicked off in the Battle of Brooklyn. Hamilton was not part of the Battle of Brooklyn because Hamilton was stationed in Manhattan. So his role was to defend Manhattan. So he was not part of the Battle of Brooklyn, but as we know, after the Battle of Brooklyn, the British troops invaded Manhattan. So this is where Hamilton began to see action. So Hamilton had his artillery unit here, and as the British invaded Manhattan and pushed Washington's troops back, Hamilton was part of this. So Hamilton was fighting under Washington here, and as the British pushed Washington up out of Manhattan, across the Hudson, into New Jersey, down through New Jersey, and into Pennsylvania, Hamilton was a part of this. And this took months. So Hamilton was fighting battle after battle after battle. He saw real action here in this war with his artillery unit. And then Washington realized that he needed some senior aides to assist Washington in the administration of this war. And what Washington really needed was he needed somebody who could write, because Washington didn't have time to write out all his orders and his dispatches and all this. He needed to focus on the administration of the war. So this is when Washington went to Hamilton and made Hamilton an offer to come and be a senior aide to George Washington. Now, this is not the type of job that Hamilton wanted. This is not how Hamilton envisioned his future. Okay? In fact, earlier on, even before Hamilton had a job in the military, he'd been offered similar positions to other military officers to be their aides. And Hamilton turned those positions down. He said, no, I don't want a desk job. I want to be on the battlefield. I want to be fighting. My future is to achieve glory on the battlefield. But when Washington made him an offer to be a senior aide to Washington, Hamilton recognized this was an extraordinary opportunity because Hamilton would be right at the top. He would be an aide to the person at the top. So immediately he accepted this position. And this is what began the relationship between George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. And this is an extraordinary relationship for this nation's history. So they became close colleagues, and this close relationship lasted for the rest of their lives until Washington's death. So Washington was about 25 years older than Hamilton. So in some respects, it was sort of like a mentor. Washington was sort of a mentor to Hamilton. But Washington also recognized that this Hamilton guy was extraordinary, and he had all these abilities. So Washington gave him a lot of responsibility. Hamilton ended up picking up that responsibility and run with it, and basically took over a lot of responsibility for himself. So Washington then became dependent upon Hamilton. So it was really a mutual relationship. They both depended upon each other. And this is one of the reasons why that relationship was so close, and it lasted for the rest of their lives. But it is a wonderful and amazing relationship in American history. So this really accounts for Hamilton's dramatic rise, because when Washington became president, the first president of the United States, Washington then appointed Hamilton as his Secretary of the Treasury. So Hamilton became the first Secretary of the Treasury. Now this is just an enormous rise. You know, think about it. It wasn't all that long ago when Hamilton was only 17 years old, arriving in New York City as an illegitimate child, an immigrant, and an orphan. And now here he is, the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States of America. It's an extraordinary rise. But Hamilton was a New Yorker through and through. So when Hamilton stepped down from the government, stepped out of his position from the Secretary of Treasury, he came back to New York City. He came back to Manhattan. Right? This was his home. So he started a law practice, and he started practicing law downtown in the Wall Street area, and lived right on Wall Street for a time. And he was representing wealthy companies and this sort of thing, wealthy people. But he remained a New Yorker through and through. In fact, Hamilton built a house in New York City. And this is the only house that Hamilton ever owned. And this house, it was a summer house. It was a seasonal house. So it was a weekend summer house, but this house exists to this day. So this is Hamilton's house, the only house that he ever owned. When he lived downtown, he was renting those places, but this was the house that he owned. And this is a fantastic place. It exists today. You can go and visit it. It is run by the National Park Service. So you can visit the grounds, and you can take tours on the inside of the house as well. And again, it is another wonderful site right in New York City that relates to the founding of this nation. Now, people think, wait a minute, country house in Manhattan? Where in the world could that be among all these skyscrapers? So here is our look of Manhattan here. So here is the downtown area here of these skyscrapers here, and this is where the city was. This is the Wall Street area, and this is where everybody lived and worked, and this is where Hamilton, rented a place to live and practice law. And in fact, actually, this is a great shot of the southern tip of Manhattan. This is the Battery right here. So this was the location of the fort where in his younger days, Hamilton and his buddies from King's College did their midnight raid and stole the cannons from the British right here at the southern tip of Manhattan. So Hamilton is living and working here in the downtown area. So where does Hamilton buy his house for his country house? Well, anything above the downtown area, so all this area was undeveloped land. It was basically like farmland, undeveloped land. So Hamilton bought his house way up in the northern area of New York City, about right here. So this is located just above in what is today the Harlem neighborhood of New York City, and it's around 140th Street. So it's still in Manhattan, still on the island of Manhattan, but it's way up on the northern tip. So it's funny because it took Hamilton the better part of almost an entire day to get from one location to the other location. Whereas today, you just jump on the West Side Highway and it's a 15-minute drive. But for Hamilton, by horse and buggy, it was almost the entire day. So Hamilton was a New Yorker through and through here. Now in 1800, there was a presidential election. Hamilton was no longer in government. But what happens in this presidential election? Well, Thomas Jefferson was elected president. This was alarming to Alexander Hamilton because remember, Jefferson was Hamilton's arch nemesis, right? From way back when, Hamilton had this vision of creating the central federal government. Jefferson was his nemesis who wanted states' rights. So now Jefferson has become the president of the United States. Hamilton is alarmed. So what does Hamilton do? Hamilton creates a newspaper in New York City. And the idea of this is to be a political newspaper that can attack President Jefferson and blast Jefferson and make him look bad and try to encourage people to rejoin Hamilton's party, the Federalists. So this newspaper was named the New York Evening Post. And amazingly, this newspaper exists to this day in New York City. And this newspaper today is the New York Post. This is the New York Post. This is a very popular newspaper in New York City. And today it's political as well. It is owned by Rupert Murdoch and the News Corporation. So it is the same people who bring you Fox News. So it is highly political from a right-wing conservative perspective, and it's a very popular daily tabloid today in New York City. Amazing. So it is wonderful to think that Hamilton founded this newspaper that still exists today in New York City. In fact, it's one of the oldest newspapers in the country that has been continuously in print. So it's amazing. Now, another event that arose out of New York issues was the tragic event of the fateful duel that ended the life of Alexander Hamilton. Now, this is just unbelievable to think about, that Hamilton, as sophisticated and intelligent as he was, could be engaged in this ridiculous behavior of dueling to the death. It just boggles the mind. Right? But it wasn't only Hamilton. His opponent, Aaron Burr, was the sitting vice president of the United States at the time of the duel. The sitting vice president. I mean, think about that today. Think about a vice president who was insulted, would engage in a gun battle to the death over a few insults. It's just boggles the mind. And this was in 1804. Wasn't that long ago. So it is amazing to think about. So the issue of this duel was all about New York. It was centered around New York issues. So what was happening was these two men knew each other. Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, they were both from New York City. They were both New Yorkers. They were both prominent attorneys in New York City. They were both prominent politicians in New York, and they had a long-standing animosity. They did not like each other for years and years and years. So what was happening in the current situation here was that Aaron Burr was vice president, but his term was coming to an end. So Aaron Burr decided that he would run for the governor of New York. And Hamilton said, no way. New York was Hamilton's backyard, right? He couldn't allow his nemesis, this guy that he despised, to become the governor of New York. So Hamilton began to start undermining Aaron Burr's bid for the governorship, and Hamilton insulted Burr in a number of ways. Burr took offense at this, and Aaron Burr challenged Hamilton to the duel. So this is how the duel got underway. Now, the duel did not occur in New York City proper. And the reason was because the laws against dueling in New York were more strict than the laws against dueling in the neighboring state of New Jersey. So if you were in New York and you wanted to duel, you wouldn't have your duel in New York City. You'd just go right across the way to New Jersey and have your duel there. So you can see here that here is New York City, Manhattan. And if you wanted to duel, what you'd do is you would cross the Hudson River right here, go into New Jersey, and there was a common dueling ground that was right across the river, right on the riverbank in New Jersey, in the town of Weehawken, New Jersey. So this is what people would do. They would just cross the river and go to these dueling grounds and have their duel. And this is what Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton did. So they have their little duel here in Weehawken. The bullet from Aaron Burr's pistol comes in and hits Alexander Hamilton in the lower right abdomen. Hamilton falls to the ground, and his assistant comes over to Hamilton and props him up. And Hamilton looks down at his wound, and he says, "It is a mortal wound." So Hamilton knows he is going to die. I mean, it's just terrible. So his assistant scoops him up, they take him down, they bundle him into the boat, they take him back across the Hudson River, back to New York City to a friend's house of Alexander Hamilton, who lived right on the edge there near the water. This is what in today is the West Village area of Manhattan. And Hamilton lives for a little while longer. His wife is able to come and see him, but the next day, Hamilton dies from his wound. This is just tragic to think that he was killed in this manner, and he was only about 49 years old. But Hamilton died in his home city of New York City. And fittingly, his final resting place is also located in New York City. And where is his final resting place? It is at Trinity Church. This is the spectacular Trinity Church. This was Hamilton's old stomping grounds. Right? This is where Hamilton was a young man reaching adulthood here, and where his buddies were practicing in the churchyard for their military unit. And Hamilton worked on Wall Street when he was a lawyer. So his final resting place is right in the yard of Trinity Church, and you can go and visit it today. It's out in the open. It's right on the southern boundary, and it is another wonderful site in New York City that you can visit regarding the founding of this nation. Now, not too far from Hamilton's final resting place is Fraunces Tavern. Now, this is an amazing building. Fraunces Tavern, this building was built in around 1719. Okay, this is some 50 plus years before the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so people think of New York City as having skyscrapers and all this. Well, New York City also has a rich history. So this building is full of history. So it was a tavern back then, and indeed it is a restaurant and a bar today. So you can go and have dinner in Fraunces Tavern and have a drink at the bar. And Fraunces Tavern is also a museum. So you can go to Fraunces Tavern here to the museum, and it has all these artifacts from the early American period and the colonial period. It is a wonderful museum. And again, it is another spectacular place to visit right in the heart of New York City regarding the founding of this nation. So Fraunces Tavern was this popular tavern back then, and remember, New York was the first capital of the nation, and this was not too far from Federal Hall. So as a result, all of these dignitaries, they patronized Fraunces Tavern. They were here. The founding fathers were here. So John Adams was at Fraunces Tavern. Alexander Hamilton was here at Fraunces Tavern. George Washington was at Fraunces Tavern. In fact, George Washington had a very significant event here. So at the end of the war, the British troops boarded their ships in the ports of New York City. They turned around and they sailed out of New York City, across the Atlantic Ocean, and back to England. So it was over. It was final. The war was over. So only 1 week later, George Washington hosted a dinner here at Fraunces Tavern. And the dinner was for George Washington and his senior officers. And the purpose was for them to certainly celebrate their victory. It's finally over. They won the war. But also, it was for George Washington to thank his officers for their service in the war, and for George Washington to give a final farewell to his officers. So this dinner was held right here in this room at Fraunces Tavern. And here is what George Washington said to his officers. "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable. And with a heart full of love and gratitude, I now bid you all farewell." Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out. Thank you.